So you've heard the positive benefits of BIM from the other speakers today, and it is here to stay. The government's promoting it, and if the rise of the NEC off the back of government promotion is anything to go by, then we shall soon be seeing an awful lot more of BIM in the private as well as public sectors, and also on smaller, not just larger projects. As said before, the strategy has no threshold, no lower threshold. Sounds great in principle, and I don't want to be all doom and gloom. Perhaps it may actually ultimately lead to the removal of delay planner, analysts, etc., as we get the 3D, 4D models coming through, and you might even be able to get rid of a lot of lawyer input on construction projects, which is probably a utopia for construction for some people in the room. But is it all good news? Well, provided you don't stick your head in the sand, then I think it is good news. You've got to embrace BIM, as has been said this morning, but you also have to embrace some changes in the way that you procure and the way you enter into your contracts. You've got to think carefully about what BIM is going to mean for you and about how you operate and what your risk appetite is. You want it to be this money-saving asset. What you don't want it to be is an added burden and an additional layer of risk. So whether you're dealing with BIM level 0, 1, 2, 3, there are some good practices you can adopt now and take forward with you so that you can appropriately manage the transition. So what's the issue? Well, BIM brings benefits, but it also brings some changes too. Changes in the procurement of a project and the project participants. You now have, as mentioned, a BIM protocol and a BIM information manager. We've met one this morning to comply with, as well as your other existing contractual obligations. Information is being shared at a whole new level and for a potentially longer period. The amount and type of information, as we've discussed today, being shared on the projects is changing. Are you going to be able to effectively control and spread the use of your information? What if some of it's confidential? How do you stop it from getting to your competitors? And are you going to be able to ensure that you don't tread on somebody else's copyright, make some infringements when you're doing some amendments, or accessing a previous BIM model information for later use? How long are you going to remain liable for the information that you've contributed to the BIM model? BIM intends to reuse process and information. So how long are you going to be liable for any mistakes? And mistakes do happen. Do you agree to its reuse? What about if third parties rely on it later? And if you rely on the BIM information model and it's wrong, then what then? The liability, is your liability going to be on the basis of reasonable skill and care, or is it perhaps fitness for purpose with the BIM model? So how do you share out the design risks, and who's going to take ultimate responsibility for the BIM model? If it's shared responsibility, is your share going to be proportionate, or should it be capped? What about the net contribution clause arrangements? How is that going to be affected by BIM? Is your insurance adequate to cover these new and extended risks? And has already been pointed out to you, there's Marcus Saunders and his new colleague Naomi over there, who can answer all your questions on insurance. So what do you need to consider? Well, as I said, I can't cover everything, but I'll point you in the right direction. If you are an employer, it starts with your procurement strategy and your invitation to tender or your ODU notice. You need to have worked out your BIM strategy before you issue your ITT. The benefits of BIM are, as said, designed to kick in from the very earliest collaboration. So have you chosen your preferred software package? If so, specify it or request proposals as part of the process. Changes later inevitably cause delay and cost. You want to know and communicate which BIM level you require compliance with and what approach you're going to require from your project team and your contractor. If you are a contractor or a consultant bidding on a project, do you know that you can actually satisfy those BIM requirements? The BIM protocol, as we've seen this morning already, is a separate document, and it needs to set out the practical ways in which the BIM approach on your project will be implemented. So who's best suited to the BIM information manager role, this new role? The contractor, or maybe the lead consultant, or are you thinking of a separate third-party provider? You'll need to review your professional appointments and ensure that the services take full account of the BIM requirements in terms of the scope of work and the duration of those services. And you'll need to make sure that your building contractor's terms incorporate the BIM protocol. You need to give it appropriate precedence in the contractual scenario. And you need to make sure that the protocol and the BIM information manager has some teeth to ensure compliance. So do you want the rights as an employer to control the BIM model, the intellectual property that's contained in it? And if so, well, you need to procure it on that basis from the start. As to risk allocation and insurance, you always need to make sure that those that are being tasked as part of your project team to take on the risk are the most capable of managing it and meeting it. And do you want project insurance? I asked earlier the government view on project insurance. There have been a number of projects going forward which have been trialling certain insurance scenarios, so I'm sure we'll have more information coming through shortly. So procuring with BIM. Well, BIM will change the division and allocation of responsibility and liability on a project. The procurement approach and standard contracts and appointments all need to have amendment to allocate the BIM risks properly and fairly based on the benefits each party is going to receive from BIM and the ability of each to control the risks and ensure or otherwise meet it. Contracts need express terms to deal with the BIM issues, in particular the BIM deliverables and the model and the responsibility for the model. A number of questions face you as an employer and the professional team, including: do you require full collaboration and sharing of risk, or will key members of the team, for example, the architect or the lead designer, still retain design responsibility? Will the BIM manager's role affect that position? For example, in managing the BIM model, inputting design, detecting, etc., all the things we talked about this morning, how are those steps going to affect what the consultants, the lead designers, are actually doing at the moment? Will the lead designer become responsible for any aspects of it? And will the designer then need appropriate warranties? Do you need to amend your standard terms and schedules of services? The answer is yes. We'll touch upon that later. And should you use a collaborative form of contract? Well, possibly. You've got the PPC 2000, and that's been updated. You need to address this at the outset to make sure that you're ready and able to meet BIM. We've already talked about the BIM protocol, and the government's backed the CIC model. That's likely to become pretty much a benchmark for BIM protocols going forward. But there are some others out there. There's the Association of Engineering Consultants Protocol, published in September 12, but still incomplete last time I looked. PPC 2000 recommend a BIM protocol as well. Some larger contractors, I'm not sure if Wilmot Dixon have their own BIM protocol in place. Yes, some of the larger ones do. Don't discount those, but obviously they've been written by a contractor. BIM started in the US, so there are a couple of protocols out there in the US as well that you can have reference to. They've been doing it longer. They've been working out what works and what doesn't. So by all means, ask me. But the CIC BIM protocol is the one that people seem to be focusing at the moment. Operates as an incorporated contract document and supposedly designed to work with the usual standard documents. Takes priority within its terms over the other contract documents and encourages the adoption of common industry standards relevant to BIM, and there are lots of them. It does create the role of the BIM information manager and coordinates the BIM in that manner. It looks at a united model with each team member supplying a smaller discrete model that goes into an overall BIM model. It adopts the data drop that's already been discussed this morning. And it also contains some detailed information as regards intellectual property rights. Not necessarily right for you, but it does have some information in there as a basis to work from. The cons, they were the pros, the cons. It needs to be properly incorporated into your contract to be effective. How am I doing on time?
You're fine.
Yeah. The contract, thank you. The contract itself must include the operative wording. Common mistake, you've got to get into the operative wording of the contract, and just referring to it may be sufficient, but it's better to actually have a copy there as part of the contract documentation. You've got to complete the appendices. We see lots of contracts with incomplete appendices. That's how this one works. You need the appendices completed, so don't forget to do that. You might find some difficulties with the priority provision in the contract if there are other documents within your contract suite of documents that you actually wanted to have priority. So you need to see how that's going to work in conjunction with the protocol. and you'll need to amend your contracts to make sure you get rid of any ambiguity between the contract documents. The information manager has no design role under this protocol. The lead designer retains responsibility for clash detection and for model coordination. Is that ideal for your project? You'll have to consider that. And as said, the intellectual property rights might need some amendment. In particular, if you are an employer and you want to actually own the IP rights, you're going to have to amend it because it stays with the actual project team member who designed it. There are change mechanisms that operate under the different forms of contract. You need to actually have a look and see whether or not it's going to work with your particular form of amended contract. Okay, thank you. So the BIM Information Manager, aka Paul. BIM projects, as said, introduce this new manager role. They need to be incorporated very early on into the project, is the advice that we're hearing. It could be adopted by any one of a number of people. It could be a contractor, or it could be one of your lead consultants, or somebody you bring in separately. Contractors do have a vested interest. They want to retain control of the information. They're going to be using it, so there is some sense in that. But a BIM protocol, which the BIM Information Manager is going to be wielding, ought really to also have some actions that can be taken against an employer that's not complying. So as an employer, do you want your contractor actually telling you what to do? The appointment is similar to other professional appointments, but you need to have a look at some particular issues. You want to have a look at the scope of services of your BIM manager, data security, access, updates, etc. What exactly is going to happen on this project? The Construction Industry Council actually has an example outline scope of services that's useful. You want to avoid any express or implied assumption of design responsibility as a BIM information manager unless you're willing to take that on and you've actually priced for it and have it covered in your insurance. You want to define the extent of your liability and your insurance obligations, but you also want to have defined in there what rights you have to compel everybody else in the project to actually comply with the BIM protocol. Thank you. So BIM contract amendments, well, these depend on which BIM level. We've heard this morning that the government's working to BIM level 2. BIM level 3 is planned if we get there, hopefully. There are some hybrids, some sort of 2+, 2 with a bit of difference, so do watch out and make sure you know what you're working with in terms of BIM. The extent of the required amendments, as usual, depends on the scale, value and complexity of the project, the form of contract being used, and whether or not that standard form contract's been heavily amended anyway, and on most projects it is heavily amended. The extent to which the relevant information is actually included in the BIM protocol that you're using, and which one is being used, and again, insurance, what insurance option you're using. JCT thinks it's got it covered. BIM Level 2 enabled projects, subject to incorporating, as I've said, the BIM protocol. There's been a public sector supplement that was published, which allows allows the employer to procure with regard to BIM. Says it achieves this by any agreed building information modelling protocol as a contract document. And then that's meant to force the contractor to comply with that contract document in the usual course. There's no equivalent duty drafted in the JCT, unsurprisingly perhaps, to place an obligation on the employer as well. So if you want, or as a team, if you as a contractor want the employer to be subject to some obligation, you're going to have to amend that. In reality, an employer who doesn't comply with the protocol and it causes some delay, disruption, etc., you're talking about an act of prevention, but it's much better to have an express term in there. The JCT is yet to publish, and I did check this morning and I couldn't see any changes, yet to publish any other BIM-related amendments, but they have promised that some are coming. There was a recent conference where the JCT chair confirmed that the long-term goal of exploring procurement practices and corresponding forms of contract is underway, and they intend to have a fully integrated BIM suite of documents out there shortly. You've also got, in the meantime, if you want to have a think about some other aspects you might need to change, have a think about requiring the contractor to comply with the BIM information manager's reasonable instructions in accordance with the BIM protocol. That's not in there at the moment. And also consider whether or not to allow the RICS new rules of measurement instead of the standard method of measurement 7, because the new rules are meant to be more BIM related, or so I understand. Right, NEC. NEC hasn't published any as yet, but having checked their website, they are planning to bring some out. I think on the 22nd of April is the promised date. The NEC says at the moment you can use its current suite of documents, the NEC3, because it's you just have to take the BIM protocol and put it into the works information in the NEC document. That then, by the operation of various clauses in the contract, makes the contractor and the employer liable in the appropriate way. You need to check again that there aren't any amendments within the NEC that you're working to that would upset that sort of scenario. Also, that you haven't got any knock-on effects of including the BIM protocol in there. PPC 2000, don't know if any of you operate with regard to the PPC 2000, but they have amended their suite of contracts. They do have some amended clauses, and they've also produced a BIM protocol for the PPC. So that might be something worth looking at if that's an area you get into. So other contract amendments, well, as said, most contracts that come across my desk are heavily amended. You need to consider some of these aspects. Do you want an express obligation, therefore, to comply with the BIM protocol, or is it simply sufficient to identify the BIM protocol in the works information, like in the NEC? Do you want the standard of care? Do you want it to be absolute fitness for purpose? Or are you actually only willing to sign up to reasonable skill and care, which is probably the better course of action? What about your subcontractors? Thank you. What about the subbies and consultants? Do they need an express obligation downstream to make them comply with the BIM protocol? Answer is yes. How do you police it? Also, how are you going to deal with the priority of documents? Should the protocol rank highest in your contract? Are there any protocol requirements you think are so significant they need to be brought into the main contract terms? So these apply to bespoke contracts as well as others. On the consultant appointments, thank you. Everybody engaged as a consultant on a project is going to have some changes to the contractual scenario with the introduction of BIM. You've got the Construction Industry Council has amended its scope of services, and it's included the role of BIM Information Manager. If you're negotiating a BIM appointment, what do you need to consider? Well, again, as mentioned before, but also you want to see, is your defined scope of services appropriate now in terms of duration and actual scope? Do your work stages need amendment? The RIBA has actually said the Plan of Work 2013 is now available, and it's got some changes in there. If you check on the website, it will run through the changes for you as to what that scope of services is. Okay, and again, the appointment needs to deal with compliance with the BIM Information Manager. Intellectual property, gritty subject with BIM. Usually the architect takes the design lead and retains responsibility and ownership for the overall design of the project. With BIM, you've got various people contributing various bits of intellectual property that make up the BIM information model. So who owns what is the question that's been asked. Who takes ultimate responsibility for the design? And is there a risk of inadvertent disclosure of your trade secrets? Who's going to own the data rights after the project's finished? And can the model be used in future projects with all your information enclosed within it? Some have suggested you could have a joint ownership of intellectual property. Others have suggested that it should be limited, the right to use should be limited to the purpose of the particular project alone. That may work. But if you're talking about, say, a license to everybody to use it, you're going to have to get everybody to agree on exercising that license to the later use. There are some complexities there that need to be thought through. So, final slide. BIM and insurance. I should really just hand over to Marcus here, but if you're operating at BIM level 2, the standard position at the moment is, rather like in the US, we think that professional indemnity existing cover will actually cover you. But what you must do is you must talk to your insurance broker and your insurance company to ensure that it does. There are some subtleties, and if your BIM level 2 is actually 2+, you might find yourself venturing into territory that your insurer isn't going to cover you for. And that applies in terms of the longevity of your liability and also your increased scope of services. As regards level 3, you heard me ask Roy, I think his name was, what's happened on these projects that the government's been undertaking, because they've been really leading the way. I think we need to double-check what the government issues with regard to integrated project insurance policies and see whether they are a way forward. But yes, Marcus will no doubt be able to answer any questions you may have. So, it is. So that's me. That's legal implications. That's a rapid overview. But I didn't want to bore you to death before lunch because I'm starving too.
Thank you, Louise.